Hello, and welcome to the final episode of Season 1 of Drop the Act. I'm your host, Chris Key, and today I'm joined by the co-founder of Performing Perfectly, Lucy Key, and we'll be discussing all things regarding effective communication and having a little look back over the guests of Season 1. Welcome, Lucy, to Drop the Act. This is a little bit strange, isn't it?
It's a little bit strange.
Because disclaimer for anyone who doesn't know, but as well as business partners, we are also partners in life, partners in crime. So having you now as a guest is a little bit strange, but is a perfect opportunity to let the listeners know a little bit more about Performing Perfectly. So
without laughing.
Well, we'll try. We'll try and do that. I think what I wanted to start off was just discussing the beginning of Performing Perfectly.
Yeah.
And as I've mentioned before on the podcast, I think, but as of course you will know and many people know, that it stemmed from the time that I was asked to give a keynote speech at the Football Association on the comparisons between elite performance in theatre and elite performance in football. And that keynote was well received and made us realise how many comparisons there are, not just with sport, but in all lines of business. But I think really it was you that sort of finessed and developed what we now have with Performing Perfectly, with our sort of 1 day, 2 day, 3 day courses. And you were integral in that process. I just sort of wondered if you could start by talking a little bit about how you put this course together, or this company together in many ways, and what you felt was important to be talking about, to be discussing, and to be teaching business leaders to help them improve their communication.
Okay, do I speak now?
You can speak now. That was a long-winded introduction.
I think it's something that I have become more and more passionate about over the last few years since doing it, because I've just realised that ultimately some of those soft skills that perhaps you and I and people within the theatre industry have taken for granted are absolutely not taught. They're not taught in schools, they're not taught to business leaders. So there isn't a training to be a leader, there isn't any training to be a communicator. And actually it is needed, I think. Some people don't need it, but I think most people need it. And using the skills that we have learned and honed over our years as performers and actors and directors seemed the perfect combination to me. And then adding into that layer of working with psychologists and coaches to work with people around possibly their mindset or their phobic responses to, say, public speaking, which again a lot of people suffer from, it just seemed to me a really necessary part of training for people. So we now work with businesses and organisations and individuals on effective communication, but that can be in many forms. Some people communicate really well, but actually they have a real problem with managing nerves. Some people are quite confident communicating, but they're just bloody boring. So they need some work on actually how to make that dynamic and interesting and engaging. And so, I think it's something that I think is a huge part of life, and communication is what we do.
You just touched on their mindset.
Yeah.
And what I didn't say in your introduction, but you just hinted at, is that your background as well is as a performer.
Yes.
So after training at Guildford and then performing as a lead in Western musicals and appearing in television, it's that experience that you bring now to Performing Perfectly. Mm-hmm. But also I suppose your life experiences as well, and I'm sure you won't mind me mentioning that mindset is something that's very important to you because of the journey you've been on as a performer. And I wonder if you would just elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, I think when I fell in love with performing from a very young age, and I was fortunate enough to have a mum and dad that really supported me and actively encouraged me. And I only ever really experienced the highs of that. I think I was the lead in school plays. I was getting jobs in amateur dramatic shows, and I just absolutely enjoyed and loved every moment of it. So when I went and made that transition into drama school, so I was fortunate to gain a place at drama school, I think I just thought that was going to be the same. And actually it wasn't, because you're leaving home, and I had a much younger sister and I was leaving her, and brothers, and I think I found it more difficult than I thought. But then in terms of actually getting jobs, again, I was fortunate enough to get a job just before I even graduated from drama school. But the pressure of that, I think, came as a massive shock to me. And one thing that I was not taught in drama schools, and I don't know if it's changed now, I hope it has, is all my training was the technical side of performance. So you had singing lessons and group vocal lessons and Shakespeare lessons and voice lessons and dance lessons and acting lessons. But there was nothing around diet and nutrition, for example, nothing around how to deal with rejection constantly, nothing around how to deal with the pressure of getting a part and performing it every night. So all of that stuff hit me, and I was very fortunate to get the role of Maria in West Side Story at the age of 22, having understudied it in the West End. And that was tricky because when I went in as the understudy, it was a very established company and they weren't massively welcoming. And I suddenly felt really insecure and really paranoid. And it was during that time that I experienced panic attacks and just a real sort of mental health issues, I suppose, that I hadn't ever understood existed. And this is in a time when mental health wasn't talked about, it wasn't a thing, so it wasn't really understood. And then I was able to get some help and support and went on to play the role. And I've been very fortunate and had some fantastic jobs, which I absolutely enjoyed. But I always felt there was this underpinning of whether it's imposter syndrome, whether it was feeling I wasn't good enough, whether it was worrying about, was I going to go on stage and have a panic attack? Was I going to experience something? So that sabotaged some of my enjoyment, if I'm completely honest. So I think now, especially now I'm older and I've got children and I've lived a much longer life, I think, God, what a waste of worry that was. I spent such a lot of time worrying and panicking and catastrophizing, as opposed to living in the moment and going, wow, look at me playing this incredible role, or look at me getting my first TV appearance. So I'm making it sound like I didn't enjoy it. I did enjoy it, but I also really battled with those demons.
I think, you mentioned we're talking, not that I'm going to reveal your age because that would be terrible, but we're talking we're talking over 20 years ago when this first started. And in fact, there were signs of this at drama school as well. This was something you battled with, and I, obviously I've known you a very long time, and mental health wasn't discussed, and I wasn't very good at understanding how you were feeling at that time, and it's something I've got to learn a lot more about as time has gone on. I could have been better at understanding, but it wasn't that. It wasn't accepted or discussed or talked about, and so therefore it was quite a lonely journey, I think, trying to navigate what it was. But it's still something that many people feel and experience today. Just linking it, I suppose, to performing perfectly and to the anxiety and the nerves that people feel around public speaking. And it is a real phobia for some people. And people who find themselves thrust into jobs where suddenly it's so important, whether it's speaking in front of hundreds or whether it's closing a deal and selling one-on-one. Yeah. We often talk about nerves being important because they tell you you're alive, but they're hard to control. So how now have you taken your experiences and how have you used them positively to help people that you're working with in the business world?
Well, I think the first thing is, for me, I needed to learn what the physiological things were that were going on in my body. And as soon as I understood that actually when you hyperventilate, which is when you breathe too much, your body then releases hormones that encourages your body to feel certain things, whether it's heat, whether it's pins and needles in your fingers, whether it's feeling like you can't take a proper breath. So understanding, okay, nothing's going to harm me here. These are just physiological symptoms that actually I can control. And what I've learnt with the years of training that I've done and people I've worked with is that being able to take control of your own nervous system is such an important tool that, again, I think, God, I wish I'd known this stuff when I was younger, because I use it now all the time. I bang on and on about breath because it is the one way in which we do have control over our limbic system. So that really deep part of our brain, that fight or flight, it's called the limbic system. The frontal lobe is where we make decisions, but when that is impaired, or telling us difficult or harmful things, then actually our limbic system suddenly goes into overdrive and we can't control ourselves. So, but actually we can control ourselves. So there's lots of tools that we can do that. And the way we speak to ourselves is one of those. Mindfulness, all the stuff that we know about, but I think possibly don't necessarily use all the time because we're busy and it goes on the back burner. But absolutely, it's something that I'm really passionate about now, and I can see people flourishing, and I think, wow, I wish that I'd had this.
And I know we use breathing techniques as part of Performing Perfectly as the beginning of the process to help calm the nerves, as a support for using the voice, and it can be used for so many things, can't it? And it can help. We encourage people just to take that moment, look at their breath, look at their physicality before they step into a room or onto the stage or whatever it might be.
And I think, when you and I learn how to breathe properly, which sounds bonkers, but that is what you start to learn at drama school, because as we're born, when we're babies, we breathe organically in the right way, and then the environments in which we inhabit and the way that we move and stresses that we carry mean that we don't often breathe properly. So relearning that as an 18-year-old was really interesting. But when we learnt it, it was purely really so that we could sing long phrases without taking a breath, for example, because it sounds more impressive. And musicians were taught it as well, especially wind musicians. You don't need it as a drummer. But what's happened over certainly the last decade, is that these techniques are now being used in hospitals with COVID patients, with patients that have got COPD or lung damage. It's being used with patients that have got chronic pain conditions. It's being used very much with patients that are struggling with mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression. So these techniques that we use from a very practical point of view are now being used in all sorts of settings and having profound effects. And it's what baffles me is the amount of control that we do have. So I don't know if you watched it with me, that Kate Winslet episode on Graham Norton, where she was doing she was talking about her filming in Avatar, and she had learnt how to hold her breath for over 7 minutes, which is such an incredibly long time.
Well, we were discussing the other day about David Blaine as well, when he did. Was he in a box of water? I can't remember what he was doing, but held his breath. But so I suppose it just goes to show that you're never too old to learn this and to train the body to be able to use the breath.
It's just, I think I didn't have any understanding of that I could do that. I had that amount of control. And the thing with breathing is it's the only mechanism in our body that is both voluntary and involuntary. And when you think about that, it's quite incredible. You have no control over anything else. Your heart will beat, your liver will continue to work, your kidneys will clear out your system, but your breath, you go to sleep at night and your body will breathe. But if I want to now, I can stop breathing. And I can choose how I breathe. And what I noticed when I was working with people, especially in roles that meant that they were leaders, but certainly having to inspire people and communicate with people on a regular basis, that sometimes when they were getting stressed or speaking, you could really hear that in their breath, which then becomes quite uncomfortable for us to listen to and uncomfortable for them. And then that would spiral out of control. And so all of these things would happen. And understanding that you can breathe in a way by learning certain techniques. So I'm doing it now, breathing in through my nose, and I'm speaking on the exhale. And then I'm doing it again. So it's slowing me down, but it's meaning that I am not over breathing. So at no point during this conversation will I hyperventilate, which means that I'm not, even if I'm feeling those feelings of nerves, they're not going to come to a point where I start to feel other physical symptoms that are going to prevent me from carrying on.
Is there, I mean, whether this will work on a podcast, obviously you can listen to podcasts, but we're also on camera with YouTube. Is there something you could just do as a little exercise? I know you can't stand up, you'll go out of camera shot, but just so people can maybe something, just a little hint or...
Okay, well, a really, really simple exercise. There are a few, but my favourite one is literally just breathing in and out. So if you're listening to this now, just take a moment to notice that when you breathe in, you're breathing down into your diaphragm. So what you don't want to happen is that your shoulders rise up. Actually, if you think about where your lungs are, they're here and they're round your back. So just take a few breaths where you're breathing in.
So in through the nose and out
in
through
the nose and out through the mouth. And just notice. And what you will notice happening is that your stomach will inflate on the in-breath and deflate on the out-breath. It's really important that you breathe in through your nose and out through the mouth. And then we're just going to breathe in for 4 seconds and out for 6. And the reason we do that is because if you exhale for longer than you inhale, you will never hyperventilate. And this is all about control. So it's not about snatching a breath for 4. It's about controlling it in for 4 seconds and controlling it out for 8. Do you want to give it a go?
Yeah, why not?
Here we go. So release any air you've got. We're going to breathe in, go 1, 2, 3, 4. And out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's do it again. But this time when you breathe out, Chris, I want you to pierce your lips so it's almost really audible on the out breath. Okay, so it's really controlling it. So this time we're going to go in for 6 through the nose and out for 8 through the mouth with pierced lips. Here we go. In 1, 2, 3, keep going. 4, 5, 6, and out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Great.
So how can people use that and how will that help in different situations?
Well, straight away, what you are doing is grounding yourself. So you are taking back control of your nervous system. So it, for one thing, it does is it actively slows down your heart rate. So what we know is that when we overbreathe, when we breathe too quickly, our heart then mimics that, so starts to beat quickly. And when our heart beats quickly, we feel breathless. And when we feel breathless, we start to feel hot. And when we so you see what I mean? It's kind of this tumbleweed. So if you did that in the car travelling to a job interview or sitting before you did an audition, if you did that at any point when you could actively feel that you were feeling anxious, then it would help. But the great thing about that particular exercise, which is why I chose it, is that you can, once you've practiced it a few times, you can use that whilst you're speaking as well. So I am doing that now. The only difference is that I am speaking on the out breath.
And I suppose having control of your breath then allows you, when you are speaking, to think about all those other things that will really help your speech, whether it's in front of a large audience or not, become more dynamic. I'm talking about being able to pause, being able to really look at your pace and the tempo and the rhythm of how you speak.
Yeah.
Because if you haven't got control of that breath, then it's really going to have a knock-on effect with all of those things.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I also bang on to people about practice. And what I notice is that the thing that you and I learned at drama school and as professional actors is that you practice and you rehearse constantly and for hours and for days before you actually go and perform. And yet I work with people all the time that will be doing a keynote speech or even just wanting to have a meeting where they're inspiring the leaders that they're working with or their colleagues. And they might prep it a little bit or think about what they're going to have on a screen behind them, that they don't think about what they're going to do themselves. So if you can practice something like breathing and allow it to become a habit that you might do every morning when you're in the shower or after you've cleaned your teeth and just work it into your day, then absolutely when you are in a situation where you want to think about your voice and tone and how you can influence or engage people, the breathing will just happen, and it's one less thing to worry about.
As we mentioned it, I mean, I do want to talk about some of the guests we've had on this season. But as we're talking
Yes.
about the voice and how to use it, you mentioned there just about pitch, and I'd love you to just elaborate a little bit about what is at our disposal that we often don't think about, and how we can use the voice to be able to make our communication far more engaging.
Well, I love the voice. I love the voice. I find it the most incredible tool that we have. I personally think, and this is my view, but as communicators, it's probably the most important thing that we have when we're talking about communicating. Body language we've got and language that we've got, but your voice, I think, because it's so personal, isn't it? You think about, I could phone you on a phone that you didn't recognise and just say hi, and you would know it was me. And that's mad, isn't it? When you think of the trillions of people in the world, and yet you could pick out that one sound and you would know it was me. One of my good friends is a motor neurose disease specialist nurse, and lots of her patients will lose their ability to speak, sometimes weeks, but sometimes months before they pass away. And she says that when they lose that, that's when she sees a real decline in their physical condition as well, because it's like that last piece of dignity, that last piece of ability to communicate. So when you think of it like that, it's such an incredible tool that I think the majority of people completely take for granted, and it really gets on my nerves, because I think you've got this wonderful voice. Most people say they don't like it. Most people don't use it properly. Most people don't understand how important it is. So in all the courses that we develop, a huge part of that will be getting people to actually start to like their voices and enjoy listening to it, and understand that generally most people have about 3 octaves. An octave is 8 notes. If I had a piano now, I'd show you. But we've got a lot of notes in our voice that we don't use. On average, we use about 5 notes of that a day, which is really boring. So understanding pitch and pause and pace. If I was to talk to you now about the voice in a completely monotone voice, which isn't really using any other notes, and I'm using a very steady pace, as much as it's clear and you completely understand what I'm saying, the chances are you're going to switch off, and so are everybody else listening. So the minute I start to use more of my voice, which I am now, and I add in pause and pitch and tone, then it becomes a completely different way of listening. And we're musicians, but I often think of it musically. If you've got if you think of something like Les Mis, that you're obviously very familiar with, and you think of A Dream to Dream, and somebody sings, and I turn your dream to shame, I'm singing all the right notes in all the right places, and it's reasonably pleasant, but it's boring and it doesn't get you in the heart. And we're going to probably talk about storytelling in a minute, but the voice, it's the dynamics, that's what makes your hair stand on end. So if I then go, and I turn your dream to shame, and still I dream, then that's what makes the audience go, oh my God. It's the dynamic.
And I think also you mentioned pitch, pause, pace, and then I'm just going to add passion to that as well. And that's something I've mentioned so much throughout with a lot of our guests. It's that idea that hopefully you're in your profession, you're running a business that you are passionate about, and therefore that needs to come out in the way you communicate. And again, it's part of
needs to
the
pour
way,
out of you.
Yeah, the way you use your voice needs to have that passion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's just we've had some great guests on this first season, and I know you've been listening avidly, I hope.
I have.
And I just wondered, what's has anything struck you? What's stood out for you throughout the season, or common themes, or people in particular, individuals?
I think all of them have had amazing stories and things to offer. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to all of them, and interestingly for me, like you, I knew quite a lot of these people, and yet I got a really deep insight into their lives and why they were doing what they were doing. I think, I mean, who do you want me to talk about first? The ACT boys, for example. I think what's really struck me about them, well, two things really. One, isn't it incredible when you really want to make something happen how you can? And that's a mindset thing.
So this is Andy Coxon and Ed Curry from AKT,
Yeah.
ACT, and their natural deodorants, their business that
idea.
began in the kitchen of their flat in London and is now
Yeah.
on the sale, well, in many countries in the world, but
Yeah.
being worn by the backing singers of Beyonce,
Yeah.
amongst many, many, many more.
And I think that the most, I'll use the word impressive, but it isn't impressive. I suppose the most interesting thing for me listening to them was when they did a piece of research about why it was that people were buying their products, and they've spent a long time making sure that it was environmentally friendly, for example, and that it was that the cost was at a price that people could afford, and all those sorts of things. And yet the thing that they realised from that piece of research was the reason people were buying their product more than any of those reasons was their story. And for me, can you hear my stomach rumbling? I'm really sorry, everybody, if you can hear my stomach rumbling. Hopefully that'll come out in the edit. The most important thing is the story, because people buy people, and people buy into stories, and people remember how you made them feel, not what you said. So actually, people hearing about these two lads, you know, literally like George's Marvellous Medicine on their stove at home, and researching, trying to find something that, one, smelt nice, two, stopped them from smelling, three, that they could wear every night on a West End show. That's what has sold them. And I think Martin Tierney has an incredible story as well. So Martin Tierney is the managing director of Seating Matters, and they make orthopaedic seats. And some people might listen to that and think, oh, that sounds boring. It's the opposite of boring. And I have been fortunate enough to work with Martin for many years in different environments. And what is so incredible about them is their story and why they're so passionate about it. Because their mum saw a patient that was struggling with dreadful sores purely because she had a condition where she couldn't sit properly because the chair wasn't giving her the support she needed. So her husband then went about and made a chair in their little shed. And these chairs have revolutionised the way that patients can now sit, which has a massive impact on their health. You know, when we sit properly, actually it has a huge impact on our ability to not get sores, to be able to breathe properly, to be able to sit in a way that we're not in pain. And their story is phenomenal.
They also, these are businesses that have developed and come out of something that is personal to them.
Yes.
Obviously, Martin's business you just mentioned, Andy and Ed, you know, Ed quite openly said that I'm quite a a smelly person, and he couldn't find anything that was working for him. Yeah. I just want to add, you know, Tess Howard, who was on last week, of course, now has an award-winning business and you know, has changed what people are wearing in the England hockey team and other sports, and her idea that people should be able to wear shorts or skirts and finding inclusive sportswear came from how she felt personally, and how actually it restricted her development. And I found it fascinating when she said to me, you know, there's so many people who are put off doing sports because of what they're being told they have to wear. And it's, you know, that sort of narrow-mindedness. It's unbelievable in many ways, but she's become, you know, she's fighting for that. So these are personal stories which helps them then with their business, but they've still got to communicate these stories.
Yes.
And then, you know, I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little bit on how people can use storytelling to help them in their businesses. You've then got stories like Mark O'Brien, you know, and he now is taken his, you know, incredible story of being told at 16 that A, he can't play professional football anymore, and B, he could possibly be dead.
Yeah.
And how he can now use his story to help others, to educate, and so he's now had to learn how to use to deliver his story. Again, we come back to how he uses his voice and everything else. But and I just wonder if you could just talk. And I know storytelling's a big part of our courses.
Storytelling is a big part of what we do, and is becoming more and more and more relevant. And we're now being asked to run courses specifically on storytelling. And I think that's because it is the most human thing that we have. We've had it from the beginning of time. And I think people don't always really understand what we mean when we talk about storytelling, but actually it's what connects us. And in business, it's so important, because in business, we often focus on the facts, or, how we sell this product to somebody. Whereas actually it's the why is it so important? And actually it's because there's a real story and a human element to all of these things. So I think, going back to what you said about the ACT boys, one of the things that I discovered a while ago reading an article, I think it was in The Guardian, but don't quote me, and I love this is a story, there was an author in America that was so interested in storytelling as a tool to sell things that he did an experiment. And all he did was he asked 100 authors in America if they would join him. They agreed. He then bought, with his own money, 100 items off eBay for about $1 each. So he spent about $100 of his own money. He then assigned each of these items to one of the authors and asked them to write a short story to accompany each item. And these were really small, some of them quite mundane things. He then resold them on eBay for $8,000.
That's remarkable.
Amazing. So he didn't do anything to them. So what was it that meant that suddenly these items had increased so much in value? What is that? And I think it's because suddenly the story makes us feel something. And when we feel something, we buy in. In this case, in monetary terms. So one of the things I think he said that he'd bought was like a little plastic horse's head. And a lady bought that for $68. But there was something in that story that suddenly connected with her that made her go, that's worth it for me. And it was worth it for her. I often talk about children in need, for example, and hugely worthy cause. And the BBC have said, when their phone lines surge, it's not when EastEnders are singing a funny song or Lenny Henry's doing a comedy bit. It's when we are watching the young person who is struggling, or the person that hasn't had water for however long, and the music comes in the background, and then we've got the very deliberately chosen famous voice narrating the words, and that is when people buy in. And we are being manipulated, one could say, but I don't think that's a bad thing. You have to manipulate people to feel what you need them to feel in order to buy in. So storytelling can massively help your business, because if you pitch it right, people will buy in far more than they will if you just stand there with your project and go, this is wonderful because it's got X, Y, Z. Actually, if you make them feel something, they'll shift.
And I think also that sometimes your story can feel ordinary to you, but actually to people who don't know your story.
Well, like Mark.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. When Mark first told us his story, it was so matter of fact. Oh, yeah, they said my heart was 3 times the size or whatever it was. Just so normal.
And then he pulled his T-shirt up to me and showed me his little thing that you can see ticking on his chest. And I was like, my God, that's incredible.
But to him, that was the journey he'd been on. But actually, to learn then how to tell that story and really help people feel and learn from his story was so important for him.
And I think metaphorically as well, using a story metaphorically sometimes, it's a great way to think about resilience, which is something else that we will talk about when we're running our courses. And Georgie and the other executive coaches that we use will talk a lot about resilience, because it's something that I feel, again, people need desperate coaching on, because we don't learn how to accept failure. We don't learn how to react when we get bullied. We don't learn how to behave when we're suddenly given a dreadful diagnosis. We don't learn that stuff. But there are tools that we can tap into that can help us. And I think with somebody like Mark, it's his life experience that has taught him how to be resilient now in life. And so that really life-changing, awful thing that happened to him, and he talks quite explicitly at some point about how, he was incredibly low. Ironically, after it had happened, I think as humans we have this innate ability to cope in the moment, and it's often afterwards that we don't cope. Businesses will often talk about that with me all the time, that people are off with stress, people are off with anxiety, because it's really stressful. And it's about how do we build our resilience and how do we look after ourselves that we can remain resilient. And it's something that I think is really important.
Just go back to storytelling for a moment. I know you've spoken before just about how we are triggered by how our hormones work with different stories, different deliveries. And can you just elaborate on that and sort of explain how we could... And you mentioned manipulate, and it's a strange word, isn't it? It sounds like you're doing something wrong, but actually, with your audience, with theatre, we want to make them feel a particular way. We want to make them laugh. We want to make them cry.
Yeah.
So how can people use storytelling in that way to know that they're really, having the effect that they want?
Well, it's connecting people. So you haven't seen this yet, but I went and watched with a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago the new Bridget Jones film. And the reason I'm mentioning
I
that...
haven't seen many of the Bridget Jones film, let alone the latest one. But anyway.
This one is brilliant. And if anybody listening to this hasn't seen it, I would really encourage you to, because it's a beautiful lesson in storytelling. And obviously film is a story, of course it is. But touching on what you just said that about hormones, is it takes the audience on a journey, a real journey. So 1 minute you are crying with laughter because it's so funny, and then another minute you're hanging on their every word because you're waiting to see what happens because there's something quite dynamic happening, and then the next minute you are in floods of tears because it is so emotionally moving. So the trick is with storytelling is to try and get your audience to feel at least one, but preferably 2 or 3 of those emotions. So when I'm running my courses, I tell 3 really personal stories of my own that are completely true to me. And one of them is to encourage people's bodies to release dopamine. The other is to release oxytocin, and the third is to release endorphins. So I take people on a journey by telling them 3 separate stories. And the reason I do that is because people then talk about how I made them feel. And it's so interesting because I can really hold the room when I tell those stories, far more than if I'm just giving technical facts about why storytelling is important. So
we can't tell 3 stories now, unfortunately. But what is the style of story that triggers which hormone, and what effect does that have?
So dopamine heightens our focus, and it also keeps us engaged. So actually, when you look at Instagram and TikTok, for example, the reason we're addicted to those things, and we are addicted to them, is because we're getting constant dopamine hits. We're swiping up and getting constant dopamine hits. So as a consequence of that, I think actually people's concentration now can be quite poor. So we have to hook people in from the start, and we have to make sure that what we are talking to them about and speaking to them about is engaging enough to enable them to keep listening. So it's keeping that level of suspense almost up. So that's dopamine. Oxytocin is a hormone that we release when we're in love with people. You're probably feeling it now, speaking to me.
Let's go with yes.
Yeah, whatever. It's what we release when we hug people. It's what we release when you first see your newborn baby. But it's also where we feel compassion and empathy. So actually, when you're needing people to feel any of those things, it's tapping in to the why. So if we're going back to Martin's story, for example, if he's thinking, okay, I've got to sell this chair, which might sound a bit boring, do you go in and go, this is really cost effective and it's made of this beautiful leather and it can do this and do that? Or do you go in and go, this chair has changed the life of Lucy, because Lucy has a disability that means that she can't do X, Y, Z. And when Lucy sat in this chair for the first time, she was able to see outside her window. And then she was able to be wheeled into the canteen and sit and have dinner for the first time ever with everybody else. And that's when people go, oh God. So the work I did with Martin, for example, was encourage him to use those stories. First of all, yes, then of course people need to know the diameters and the cost and all of that. But why do people need to buy it? Because it's absolutely life-changing. That's why. So that's oxytocin. And the third one is endorphins. And endorphins is what we have when we exercise. It's what we have when we laugh. It's what we feel when we feel really good. And I think in business, we get very stuck in the serious, mundane, kind of factual processes, systems. And actually, sometimes you just need to inject a bit of humour. You need to make things lighter, because that's what connects us as human beings. So the third story I tell is just a really, really quick, funny story about our oldest son, Noah, and people really laugh. And I say to them after, how do you feel now? Oh, I feel really good. So it's really important that we take that level of care when we are storytelling to people, but also when we're trying to sell a product or sell an idea or influence people.
Just going back to Martin, it just got me thinking then about, all of the guests, but what an important part culture is within a business.
Yeah.
Martin, we've both been to his factory. We both experienced the sort of culture that he's tried to introduce there. And also, I just want to mention Amy Merricks. She was one of our very early guests. And what's interesting with Amy is that I was interviewing her when she was in pre-season with Birmingham City. And this was her first season with them. As we speak at the moment, she's top of the Women's Championship. She just got the Manager of the Month award for February. She's doing extremely well, and she had her vision, she had her culture, she had the way she wanted to set up.
Yeah.
And it would appear that it's working well, and I know that it works very well for Martin and a lot of our guests. But it's so important, isn't it, to set up that right culture?
Oh, I think if you can create a positive culture within any business or organisation, then you are halfway there. And it's because it's about people, isn't it? And I wrote something down. Yeah, Martin is driven by people, not profit. He's driven by the people that he works with. And what I love about Martin is he'll say, if I'm interviewing somebody and they're clearly nervous and I'm asking them questions, I'll go, well, what? Hang on a minute. I don't really want to know about what you did in your last job or how many projects you sold. Tell me about you. And somebody will tell them a really personal story about how they're adopting a child and then he'll say, and then I go, I want them to work for me because that person's got integrity. That person's got heart. That person's got.
I think it was a carer's heart, was it? The phrase he used, a servant's heart.
A servant's heart.
Yeah.
And such an important value to have. Whereas most people, when they go into an interview, and actually a lot of interviewers, it's very much about what grades have you got? So what have you achieved in your last job? What about this? As opposed to looking at the person as a whole and going, what are you going to bring to my organisation? So I think that both Amy and Martin spoke really beautifully and articulately about how they create culture. And ultimately, that's about how they look after their staff and how they value their staff and how they respect their staff. And, Martin has this incredible morning meeting every day. And it just means that everybody's on a level. Everybody is valued. Everybody gets an opportunity. And then he encourages everybody just to talk about something that they're grateful for. And those little things are integral to starting people's day in a positive way, feeling like they want to work that day, they want to do their best, and they do.
You mentioned resilience a while ago. Obviously, Mark and Tess as well, they both had serious knee injuries. Regardless of Mark's heart issues, he also had other injuries, which probably, in comparison to the heart, were minor. But actually, as a professional,
as an athlete, it's still a significant...
Exactly. And Tess, missed out on the Olympics because of that injury. Or was it not the Olympics? But anyway, she had to fight to get back to fitness to go to the Olympics. That resilience is so necessary. We also spoke to actors, to Kaylee O'Connor and Connor Galooly, difficult names to get right, who spoke a lot about rejection. So I suppose that resilience and that rejection is a massive part. They're two things that we don't often talk about within business, but how as actors we're sort of used to that setback, that knockback, and you get to the point where you just have to go for an audition and then forget about it, because 9 times out of 10 you won't get that job. Whereas Connor and Kaylee really spoke about how rejection actually is a tool to success to them, how they use it to build on and go from strength to strength. And so I thought it was interesting hearing that sort of resilience and rejection idea, and how we do need to be strong in business.
I think most people learn resilience through a life experience. So Mark, at the age of 16, being delivered that really major news that if he didn't have a heart operation within a year, he would die. We've got a 16-year-old son. I can't imagine how he would cope with that. He would, because he'd have to, and we'd support him through it. But he hasn't been taught how to be resilient at school, has he? He's been taught maths and English and science, and that there isn't any of that learning. So somebody like Mark has learnt that through experience. And I think probably most of us have learnt how to be resilient because we've had to be resilient at different times. But I think it is something that's really important, because I personally think now, and some people may not agree with me, that we are now raising children who often aren't very resilient, because there's a lot of helicopter parenting going on, and we give them so much. And I include ourselves as parents in that to an extent.
You're going to have to explain what helicopter parenting is to me.
Have you not heard that?
No.
When you're like looking down and controlling everything that your child's doing.
Oh,
so
right.
even your child is late for school because they haven't got up early enough, but you go and rescue them. You're the helicopter parent. You go and rescue them and you drive them to school so they're not late. Whereas actually what would happen if you just let them be late? I would argue that they'd probably get told off, or they might even get detention, but they will learn then. And all of this is resilience. And it's something that I think when I listen to people like Mark who have experienced something and yet are now able to talk about what that's given them. That one of my best friends died nearly 4 years ago, and seeing the resilience of her family has been really interesting. So I'm sure he wouldn't mind me sharing, but Mark will say, her husband, the stuff that I used to worry about, the stuff that I would tie myself up in knots about, just doesn't matter anymore, because it wasn't until he experienced something so unbelievably devastating that he then was able to put things into a different perspective. And that is resilience. So I think actually we have to fail, we have to get things wrong, and that's, again, Tess talked about that. Connor and Kaylee talked about that. We have to see those mistakes as positives, and take every time we make a mistake, when we hear ourselves going, oh my God, this is awful, and this is dreadful, and the world hates me, and everything's awful, actually going, do you know what? This is going to make me stronger in the long run. I'm going to take this, and what can I find out? What can I find out of this is going to be positive? How can I use this in some way? As opposed to playing a violin and feeling really sorry for ourselves.
One of the themes that came out a lot across the podcast was authenticity. Even I sort of slightly offended Chris Sutton, I think, by saying to him, is this sort of dour act that you put on, is that a performance you've chosen? He was like, well, no, that's just me.
It's just who I am.
But he's very honest and authentic. He's very passionate about what he does, and his role now as a pundit, and but on Radio 5 606 phone-in, he's playing up to that. He's having fun with that character a little bit as well. But we spoke to Connor and Kaylee, two actors, but we often talk to people within business about how you must always be authentic, but there will be various different versions of yourself that you'll need to step into.
Yeah, and I think people struggle with that because they just go, well, this is who I am. Whereas I think we are all made up of multiple personalities in many ways, aren't we? And I've often said, I can be completely authentic, but I might tell a joke to you that I wouldn't tell to my mum because she would be offended by it and you wouldn't. Now, that's not me being unauthentic. It's just me being mindful of my audience. And I might be, really, really chatty with one person and not so much with another. Or I might be. So it's just about understanding which version of yourself you need to be, whichever situation you are in. And I think what a lot of our podcast guests have shown us this season is how self-aware they are. So lots of the courses that we are running, ultimately, when we're throwing so much at them, be it body language and voice and authenticity and resilience, all the time I'm saying this is really just about heightening your self-awareness, so you know how you operate, what enables you to get up out of bed every morning and do what you do, and just give them some hints and tips, sometimes practically, sometimes from a mindset point of view, as how they can be the best versions of themselves. I often talk about, in theatre, for example, I could get up in the morning and I could go and I could do a show to 2,000 people in the audience, and I'm feeling great, and it's a beautiful sunny morning and I'm in good voice, and those people have spent 150 quid on a ticket and they go away happy and I've done a great performance. But a week later, somebody else comes to watch the show, but I've lost my wallet on the tube and I've had an argument with you before I left the house and I've got a bit of a cold coming on. So I'm feeling a completely different way than I felt the previous week. But I have to give the same performance because those people have paid for it and they deserve to see it. Now, is that me being unauthentic? No, I don't think it is. It's me doing what I need to do in that moment. Now, I might come off stage and give you a ring and have a cry or phone my best friend and say, oh, I'm having a crap day. But actually, in the moment, I need to do what I do. And I think sometimes business leaders forget that actually authenticity comes in all sorts of ways. But we all have different versions of ourselves. I'm a different version of myself when I'm standing watching football with our son on a Sunday than I am delivering a keynote speech, than I am sitting in the sofa in front of you. But they're all true to me. They're all really me. But I'm making a decision.
And I suppose when going back to Martin's employees with a servant's heart,
yeah,
they need to demonstrate that with every situation that they're faced with. So.
Yeah.
It's important that they can step into that role in that moment, regardless of what's going on. And that does involve a slight performance sometimes.
Yeah.
It has to.
Yeah, it does.
You were just discussing body language, voice language, the three components of effective communication. And we always discuss how, effective communication will happen when all three of those items are congruent.
Yeah.
So when our body language matches our tone of voice and the words that we choose, then we will truly...
Those three components are aligned. Yeah, completely congruent. I believe that is when we reach 100% communication, if there is such a thing, effective communication.
And when we don't, based on the Albert Mehrabian theory... Mm-hmm. It's the body language that will be read.
Yeah.
That's what people will take away.
Well, our body language introduces us, doesn't it? And I hate to do this in front of you, but I'm just gonna give you a bit of a big head for a minute. When I went to Japan with you last year, and I came into the rehearsal room, that was really apparent to me because you were at one point directing over 100 people because it's triple cast, and you were talking to them all, and I was watching you and I thought, my God, everybody in this room is hanging on his every word. Except they weren't hanging on every word because they couldn't understand a word you were saying because they don't speak English. So I was thinking, why are they so engaged with Chris? And it was because they were hanging on your passion, and they were hanging on your energy, and they were hanging on your body language. And I know that we've spoken about that comes quite naturally for you because you believe in the piece, but you've also had to make a decision. in those circumstances to go, they cannot understand the words I'm saying. They're getting that from a translator. So they've got to get everything else from my physicality and my passion, and it was oozing from you. And so it didn't matter in that moment. One of the things I often advise people to do is film themselves and watch themselves back. And people go, oh, I don't like doing it. And I go, but if you're expecting everybody else to, and quite often I'll say, turn the volume off and just watch your body language, because that will tell you a million stories as well. And so, again, all of these things are about being really self-aware. What do I look like to other people? How do people perceive me? How do I sound? How am I engaging people?
Let's jump to one of our colleagues, our friends, Claire Colvin.
Yes.
Who we've worked with a few times as part of their simple scaling course over in Belfast. And Claire is such infectious energy. She's a very positive person, and she discussed that a little bit when she was chatting and sort of basically going into any discussion, negotiation with good faith and
Yeah.
you know, assuming that there are good people out there. The one thing we haven't mentioned really is about the language we use, and just I was thinking about Claire and thinking about positivity, and therefore thinking about positive language and the words that we choose in particular situations.
Yeah, and I think again, when we are writing courses for people, we will talk a lot about the language that they use. And positive language, I think sometimes people don't quite understand what it means, but essentially the language that we use has a physiological effect on us. And we can all remember times when somebody said something nasty to us or unkind, and you will have a physical response. You'll go hot or shaky. And equally, when somebody says something wonderful to you, you remember that feeling. So when we're writing things down or we're speaking to people, that will happen to them as well. So even in emails, you know, I will say to people, think about that before you press send, because all that person's got is the language. They haven't got your voice or your body language. So if I write an email to you that says, will that report be ready by Friday? Depending on how you're feeling that day, you might think that I'm being arsey, you know. Will that report be ready by Friday? Whereas actually I'm saying, will that report be ready by Friday? Because I really need it. So how we interpret language is really important. So using clean language and language that's going to be difficult for people to find offensive is really useful. And actually what we've noticed now, and it's certainly in sport, is there's been different bits of research that show if you shout on the sideline to a footballer, keep possession, as opposed to don't lose the ball, they're more likely to. If I say to you, remember your keys before you leave the house, you're more likely to remember them than if I'd said, don't forget. So it's always using the positive intent. And what's interesting with children is that we're always telling them what not to do. Don't do this, don't run, don't that, don't do this. And actually our brains are much more inclined to hear the positives. So in business, it's very easy to tell people, and I know you've said as a director, to tell people what's wrong, what's not good enough.
Well, I've said this on the podcast, but I'll say it again, you know, for anyone who didn't hear it. You know, I had a terrible situation where I was, you know, I felt like I was...
You were basically really horrible. Well,
no, I was focusing on what was wrong.
Yeah.
Because I've got to fix the problems, was the way my brain was working.
And you do that. And I do have to pick you up on that, don't I?
Well,
quite a lot.
Yes. And in doing so, I picked on all the negatives in a performance when actually they were outweighed by positives.
Of course.
But of course, all the actor heard was the negatives and said, am I doing anything right? And I was mortified in that moment. So yes.
But the good thing is, in that moment, you were self-aware enough to go, gosh, I have unintentionally made this person feel this way, and therefore I am not going to get the best out of him as an actor. So what can I do moving forward? And that's the point. None of us are perfect. I use language that probably isn't the best some of the time, but the difference is I'll catch myself doing it. So the language that we use is terribly important. And there's lots of little hints and tricks that we will use. We will tell people, you know, one of them might be that should can make people defensive. If I say to you, you know, you should really do this, you're less likely to do it than if I say, you could do this, actually, Chris. You're far more likely to do it. So Actually, in business, telling people what they should do never really gets the results that you would probably like. But going back to Claire, Claire is somebody that comes from a place of optimism and positivity, but not in an irritating way, in a completely human way, where she walks into a space and she's expecting everybody to be lovely. That's what she said. And actually, of course, if people aren't, then she'll go, okay, I'm getting rid. But ultimately, she's giving people the benefit of the doubt. I listened to a really, really interesting podcast the other day with Brené Brown, who I love. And she said something that I've really found quite profound, which was that the emotion that human beings struggle with the most, can you guess? What do you think?
Happiness.
Well, joy.
Yeah.
And she said, it's because we don't lean into joy. We're worried about what's going to ruin it. And she said, we spend a lot of time rehearsing tragedy, rehearsing that something bad's going to happen in our heads. And actually, she said, if you suddenly sit back and go, actually, things are quite good at the minute. I'm doing a podcast with my husband. We're both healthy. We've got 2 children. Are they doing okay? Yeah, they are actually. We've got food on the table. We've got a pretty good life. Actually, if you allow yourself to lean into that, what often we'll do is go, oh God, what's going to go wrong? What's going to happen? And we start worrying about things that have never happened. And she says that she had a really interesting conversation with a man who said, I've always been really careful with my emotions. I never really got too happy about anything or too worried. I've just sort of stayed on a level playing field. And his wife and him were in a car accident, and they'd been married for 40 years, and she died and he survived. And he said, I wish I'd leaned into those moments of joy, because now she's gone, I can't get those back, and I didn't appreciate them. And I think that it really, really impacted on me, that podcast, because I thought, wow, isn't that sad that as human beings we look for the negatives? We've spoken about it before. We could do a course with 100 people and get 99 fantastic written feedbacks and 1 not so good. And what do? We pick at the one that's not so good, as opposed to going, but 99 out of 100 people loved that. And that's what Claire does. And I think it's a really, really, really important lesson for us all. But it doesn't come naturally. There's a really good TED talk by somebody called Alison Ledgerwood, where she talks about how we have to practice seeking out the positives, because as human beings, we're much better at seeking out the negatives.
I used to think that maybe that was sort of in my nature because of the acting profession, because it is something where the highs are high, the lows are low, and there's a lot of negatives because there's a lot of rejection, because as I said earlier, you're more likely not to get, and you're constantly trying to do things right, and you're worrying about doing things wrong because that might affect whether you'll get the job or whether you're kept on in a job. But I suppose that's across the board, isn't it? It's the same in any industry. It's all
we look at the targets we haven't met as opposed to the ones that we have, or and it's not about being unnecessarily or unrealistic. This is not about being unrealistic, but it's about going, what's going to be useful here? Is it going to be useful to have my team in front of me and give them a list of things that haven't gone right and targets we haven't met? Or to say, look, we may not have achieved X, Y, and Z, and we really need to do this. However, what we have done is this, this, and this. And I know that by implementing this, we're going to be able to get this. So this is maybe tricky. And we're going to say tricky, not difficult, because people tend to handle that word better. People don't like difficult. This might be tricky, but actually, by doing this, 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 we're going to make this work. So if you want to be an inspiring leader, it's knowing those things, because lots of people don't,
Well, that seems like a very perfect place to wrap this up. Lucy, thank you very much. It's a bit weird, but actually we got through that. So
we did that. I'm actually quite disappointed that we didn't have any laughing fits or anything.
No, well, anyway, maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Maybe we will.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, my love.
So that is the end of season 1 of Drop the Act, and season 2 will be with you very, very soon. Please, as always, can you like, subscribe, or rate the podcast? And we've already got some exciting guests coming up. See you next time.